So, one of the interesting things about this psalm is that it's got a structure to it. And the structure is prayer, hear my cry, the central section, he has heard my cry, and praise. And it's a particular structure which you can see in a number of other psalms as well. They often have, Hebrew poetry has this sense of an internal structure within it. This is actually the third of a group of psalms that begin at Psalm 26. The temple, the house of the Lord, is the focus. In Psalm 26, the worshipper, as he approaches, is searched by God's demand for sincerity. In Psalm 27, he sees God's house, as a sanctuary from his enemies and a place of vision. And here in Psalm 28, he brings forward his petition, spreading his hands in supplication towards the Holy of Holies, and he receives his answer. In this psalm, the fear of being reckoned with the wicked and cast away is very strong. But so is the answer, as he asks for deliverance for the people as a whole. You could say that this psalm takes us back to Psalm 1. You may remember in Psalm 1, when it's speaking of the wicked, it speaks of walk, stand, and sit, degrees of wickedness. And this psalm also early on looks at the whole question of evil and wickedness and finds the writer appealing to God in probably quite a critical health condition, saying to God, don't count me amongst the wicked. It also speaks about the grave, although it isn't simply the grave. The Hebrew word is pit or Sheol, S-H-E-O-L, in verse 1. And going down to the pit is rephrased again in a number of psalms. You could look, for instance, at Psalm 143, verse 7. You could also look at Psalm 30, verse 3, and see that it means not only death, this pit or Sheol that God is, that he doesn't want to go down to, but it's also the deepest confines of a dungeon, the darkness of a dungeon. It's also seen in 1 Samuel 14 as a sepulchre, and in Psalm 88, verse 4, it's regarded as the world of the dead, the pit. Rock is an interesting little word in verse 1 as well, God the rock. It's used 9 times in Deuteronomy, which is interesting because if you think about it, that was the wilderness, the Sinai wilderness. And there's some suggestion that in the granite peaks of Sinai, the idea of God being our rock was first commissioned, if you like, first regarded as an important picture. And it's the idea not of the height of the rocks, but actually of the strength and the stability. God is the strength and the stability that undergirds our lives. And if you think about the parable of Jesus, the wise man built his house upon the rock. There's that real sense of a foundation, God, the steady and safe foundation for our lives. But he also says, don't turn a deaf ear to me. Don't turn from me in silence. And there's a sense not only of deafness in this, but also of dumbness. Don't be silent. Don't close your ears. And we use a similar phrase, don't we, when we say someone is deaf and dumb. And there's that sense in verse 1. In verse 2, we find a number of things that are quite interesting. One is the uplifting of hands as an expression of prayer. And you can find that in Psalm 63, verse 4, the empty-handed beseeching of favor by lifting up the hands in prayer. It's also seen in Exodus 17, verse 9. And not only is it the idea of prayer, but asking God to call down the power of heaven on others, and really on the psalmist in this particular case. God being beseeched, please bring down the power of heaven. And sometimes in our prayers, we forget that actually as we lift up our hands to God, as we ask God, this is the God who has the power of the universe in his hands. If you want to look at something in the New Testament that shows that the early church had this Jewish idea of lifting up hands in prayer, go to 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 8, and you'll see that this is an expression and an idea that's used by the early church. In our churches, we've learned to raise our hands in prayer once more, usually in praise. But imagine raising your hands and saying to God, bring down your power, your powerful presence, the power of your love and your reality, as we ask you, as we beseech you. Perhaps more of us, especially Anglicans, should be raising our hands and calling down the power of God in prayer. In verses 3 to 5, we have a number of little images. One is, drag me not away with the wicked. And there are echoes of Ezekiel 32, verse 18, in which God judges the wicked nations and drags them to death and destruction. Sometimes as we look at the wicked, we think they're getting away with it. But actually the judgment reminds us that God will bring them to judgment whether they like it or not, dragging them. And often that's the way people who do evil things will often not want to admit that they've done them. I remember working in the top security prisons, and that was always an issue. Do you understand what you have done? Are you prepared to face it openly and honestly? And so often the wicked won't do that, but God will not let them get away with it. He will, if necessary, drag them to judgment. The wicked portrayed here is a wickedness that's of speaking and duplicity. It's not simply hypocrisy, the wicked who are hypocrites, but it's actually that sense of deliberate falsehood, a perception by them that doesn't really tally with reality. People who deliberately paint a picture that's false and incorrect, knowing that people are going to take it hook, line, and sinker. And the Old Testament perception of Satan, of course, is the great liar, the one who distorts and destroys through his lies. And there's a real sense here that we as Christians and the Jews as God's people need to understand their own gullibility. We are so often taken in by words which are deceptive. We find it around us when we listen to people, but also when we hear that voice inside that tells us that the world isn't as it really is. And this verse has that sense within it. It also suggests that injustice stings deeply, and that any healthy conscience will protest at the wrongs of the present order of things. When we look around us and say, this is not right, we're right. There's a sense in which that's exactly what injustice should do to all of us. This is not correct. Things should be different. So we then, as the psalmist did, we see the day of judgment as a necessity to right the wrongs that have been done. That's why God's elect cry out to him day and night, and we find his anger already aroused at injustice. You can find that in Luke 18, verse 7, God's anger at the injustices of the world. And then in verse 4, give back to them according to their deeds. So often this is the cry of the human heart, isn't it? Somebody does something that's awful, horrible, and instantly it's a cry, make them experience the evil for themselves. And it's interesting that Yahweh brings justice clearly and unambiguously and vindicates himself. He shows what sort of God he is himself and those who are faithful to him by the way that he acts. You can see this in Isaiah chapter 3, verses 8 to 11. But perhaps the best place that you can see it is in Judges chapter 1, verses 5 and 7. You could easily fly past it without really listening to it. But it's an interesting little story of how God gives retribution on evil deeds. Adoni Bezek is the name of the man, the king who the Judah people came against and cast out of the promised land. 70 kings he took, and he cut off their thumbs and big toes. You may remember. Mm-hmm. And the writer of Joshua says that God paid him back for that evil by him being thrown out of his kingship and his life taken from him. There's an awareness of the depths and just deserts of evil. And as we look around our world, we have names like Hitler, Pol Pot, Idi Amin, Stalin, There are so many names. The Moors murderers, so many others. And as we look at them, we think the enormity of their crimes needs to be brought home to them. They need to see that what they have done is evil, horrible things. And God, and indeed it's only God, needs to bring them to justice. Ultimately, many of these people have died, and many people say, well, they never really faced what they did. But the reality is that God at the judgment will put right the wrongs that they have done and will hold them accountable. And that's a great confidence that the psalmist has. In verse 5, God will not build up the wicked, but will pull them down. He'll pull down the work of their hands. And you can see that this idea of pulling down is very much an idea that we see in the prophet Jeremiah. In fact, we see it again and again. Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 10, Jeremiah chapter 18, verse 9, Jeremiah 42, verse 10. This is the idea that the wicked forget God's strict and even-handed justice. And we're thinking, and God will tear them down because of it. We think about the motivation of the wicked. It's often self-centeredness, a lust for power, a lust for wealth, a lust for fame, and they care nothing at all for God. So there should be no complaints when God unmakes their world and repays them for their wickedness and injustice. At the judgment, we believe that will happen. And I have often said to people, particularly in the prison ministry, you may think you've escaped justice, but one day you will stand before God and you will have to answer for what you've done. And if justice has not been done, you will receive God's justice on your wickedness. We then come to verse 6, and there seems to be a change of tone and a change of emphasis. Suddenly, in verse 6, we get this burst of thanksgiving, raising issues for a number of scholars because it's such a big change. One of the questions asked is, was there a lapse of time between the first part of the psalm, verses 1 to 5, and the second part? The second question that's asked is the psalm a weaving together of two different psalms and ideas, with this verse 6 very much being the connection? If you were putting together two pieces of cloth, it would be the binding that binds them together. And the other question that's asked is, this particular verse, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I understand from the Hebrew scholars, it's got not only, we can see the different ideas, but what we can't see in the English is the change of rhythm. It doesn't sit easily with the rest of the psalm, either before or after. It's a change of rhythm that's discordant. So they ask, was this part of the way that the psalm was edited? And very much verse 6 is an answer to verse 2. Hear my cry, he has heard my cry. We then go on to verses 7, 8, and 9. And in verse 7, there's a picture of God's saving power, his care, which is seen profusely in all around us. So you get God's active care, the strength, and the shepherd. And you get, if you like, his defensive care, the shield and the refuge. Verses 7 and 9. The strength and shield of this verse echoes the rock of verse 1. Go back to verse 1, the rock, strength and shield. My heart greatly rejoices. A better sense of this, and it was in the version that we had, it seemed very clearly, is dances for joy. You may remember David dancing before the Lord in joy as the ark went into Jerusalem. And, you know, I think one day I look forward to the day when we go in and we sing in a wonderful hymn, or maybe the Gloria, and everybody gets up and starts dancing. There is something about dancing that's so much a reality in the life of worship. What the end of this verse could read is, and when I have been helped, my heart will dance for joy. When I will have been helped, my heart will dance for joy. And one of the great expressions of our Christian faith is that as Christians, we have that sense of a dancing heart. And if we don't have it, can I just say, let's ask for it. a dancing heart before the Lord. Verse 8 and 9 open out from the singular to the plural. So up to this point, we've had the singular used, but suddenly we see in these last two verses an incorporation of the whole of the people, the plural form. Just as the poet distances himself from the wicked early in the psalm, so here in this verse, he aligns himself with God's people, with the other group of people to which he belongs, the assembly of the righteous. God's blessings are not just for him, but for all of God's people. And this sense of the anointed, which you can find in verse 8, is really saying that the anointed one, the Christos, literally the Christ, the anointed one, the shepherd that we go on to hear about in verse 9, is actually a representative of the people. And we see in Christ these two images coming together, the anointed and the shepherd. And we see him as a representative for us on the cross and representing us and all that God is calling us to beyond the resurrection. Tomorrow is Ascension Day. We'll think about Christ going to be in the heavenly court, and we know that our representative is there for us and with us. We go on to verse 9, and in verse 9, we see something that's quite interesting, which is one of the lines of the Te Deum. Now, we're increasingly losing touch with this. It's something that's sung in the morning worship in the Anglican Church, but the Te Deum is reflected in the first line. Save your people and bless your inheritance. And we actually go on to say, lift them up and carry them forever. Raise them up and carry them forever. It's something that has been incorporated into Christian worship. This idea of Jesus the shepherd raising us up. And it strikes me that actually this whole verse reminds us of the goodness of God. It reminds us of the feeding and the care that the shepherd gives. And if you want to see some of that, then you need to look not only at Psalm 23, which we looked at last time, but also Isaiah 40 verse 11, Isaiah 63 verse 9, and Isaiah 46 verses 1 to 7, the idea of God carrying us. So to sum up, we have the prayer in this. Hear me, and don't count me as one of the wicked. We have the idea of the wicked. Lord, deal with them. Pay them back in your judgment and uphold your justice and your character. And then the resolution. God has heard my cry. He is my strength and my protection. So I will dance and sing for joy. As my salvation, he saves me, blesses me, carries me, and shepherds me. I hope that you've enjoyed this psalm, and we've got 10 minutes now to have a little discussion.